In this video, I'm going to show you how I turned my suburban backyard into a profitable no-till market garden on less than a quarter acre. And make sure you watch it till the end, because I'm going to share with you some of the hardships that almost put me out of business my first year as a full-time market gardener. And then we're also going to talk about if this is actually a viable way that you could make a living. Come on, let's go, baby. Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Chef Mikey. Welcome back to Chef's Harvest Farm. If you're new to the channel, I'm a former executive chef who turned my gardening hobby into a six-figure business. All the drone footage you'll see on this video was shot by the Venix V11 Pro drone. Huge shout out to Tina and Venix for their support. And if you'd like to grab a drone to take shots of your small farm or homestead, check out the discount code they've given us below. So we bought this house back in 2017, and at the making of this video, it's November of 2024. It's a 1 acre property with a house towards the front and a relatively flat grass backyard. We knew we wanted a small piece of land so we could grow our own food. I had recently quit my job as an executive chef, and I started selling restaurant equipment at K-Tom Restaurant Supply. My wife and I had started shopping at the farmers market here at Market Square in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we were inspired to grow our own food. I had no idea at the time that in just a few short years I would turn our backyard into a small-scale vegetable operation which supplies produce to some of the top chefs in the world and become one of the most popular growers at the farmers market I once attended weekly as a customer. So pretty much the day after we moved into this house, I went down to Home Depot, I bought some wood and bagged soil, and I built a raised bed garden right in the middle of our backyard. And this was in March of 2017. I'd been growing a tomato plant and a pepper plant by our windowsill in our apartment. I immediately took them outside and I planted them in my garden, and I come out the next day and they were dead. I had no idea that you had to harden plants off before you plant them outside, and I didn't know you couldn't grow tomatoes and peppers in March in Tennessee. Turns out that growing vegetables was going to be way harder than I thought. So I spent the next couple of years studying how to grow vegetables and building more raised bed gardens in the backyard. Eventually we had dozens of raised garden beds, and I started to see more success. My mother was selling tea at a farmer's market in Scarborough, Maine, which is the town I grew up in, and she told me about this farmer in town and told me I should follow him on Instagram. So I did. His name is Daniel Mays, and he owns Frith Farm in Scarborough, Maine. He didn't post often, but when he did, he had my attention. He was promoting what he called human-scale farming, using no-till gardening methods where they primarily use hand tools in the fields rather than tractors, and they use large silage tarps to kill the grass and weeds rather than tilling or using herbicides. He used cover crops to boost soil health rather than fertilizers. These methods resonated with me as I didn't need to make any type of large investment or know how to use any type of machinery like a tractor or a tiller to get started. At the time, I'd been watching a ton of Curtis Stone videos, and he recommends that you buy a BCS two-wheeled tractor to start an urban scale farm, but those things cost like 10 grand with the implements I would need, and I wasn't trying to put up that kind of money to get started. This is just a hobby that maybe someday could potentially become a business, you know? So in October of 2019, I laid down my first silage tarp and I started killing a portion of the grass in my backyard. The silage tarp cost about $200, and I got some free pallets from work to hold them down, and then I just let time do the work. The silage tarp was 105 feet long and 24 feet wide. I cut it in half the long way and I overlapped the two pieces to create a garden plot that was roughly 50 feet long by 40 feet wide. And no matter what, I would never recommend that anybody buy a larger silage tarp than that. They're insanely heavy, large, and hard to move, so you'd be better off just buying several smaller ones. And you never want to use any other type of tarp either. Besides a silage tarp, these tarps are specially UV treated to withstand the harsh rays of the sun. So this created an outline for me to design my garden so that they're all 50 feet long. The length of your garden beds is not what's important. What's important is that you make all your garden beds the same size. This way, all my drip lines and row covers, including frost blankets, insect nets, and shade cloths, are all exactly the same size, so I never spend any time trying to find the correct drip lines for a particular bed or the right row covers. They're all exactly the same size. I can just grab any one and use them on any garden bed. I had taken what I learned from Daniel's Instagram posts, and I started to search the internet for more information on no-till methods and cover crops, and I started watching YouTube videos. Found the work of Curtis Stone, Jesse Frost from the No-Till Growers, and Josh Satin, along with several others. And then I saw Jesse Frost was hosting an event with Daniel Mays from Frith Farm at the Rough Draft Farmstead, and I was probably the first person to sign up. At this point, I had several dozen raised beds, and I just laid down my first silage tarp, with the intention of starting my first no-till market garden. I attended the workshop and I soaked everything up like a sponge. Josh Satin was there and he recorded the entire presentation and he sent me a copy of it to have. I've watched and listened to the entire presentation hundreds of times, literally, and I still do today from time to time. And after a few months of being tarped through the fall and into the winter, I started building my no-till beds in January of that year. When I peeled the tarp back in the middle of the winter, the grass was like kinda dead. I bought some wooden stakes from Home Depot and I measured out 30-inch wide beds and 14-inch wide walkways, and then I tied a string from one end to the other so I could keep the rows nice and straight. It's always been important to me that all my garden beds are the same size, 50 feet long, 30 inches wide, and 14-inch wide walkways. I went down to our local mushroom farm and I had my truck filled with mushroom compost. Then I filled the beds with about 6 inches deep of compost and covered it all again with the tarps. A few weeks later, I called my boy Paul from Mountain Roots Farm. Today he's one of my best friends, but at the time, I'd only bought veggies from him a few times at the farmer's market, but he also attended the Frith Farm event where we got to know each other a little bit better, and he told me he had a tree service company. So I asked him if I could get some wood chips from him, and he agreed to load me up for free. So since then, I've always got my wood chips from getchipdrop.com. It's like a internet service where you just sign up to be a location for tree services to drop off wood chips for you, and I've always had great success using that, so I just never wanted to bother Paul with my wood chip obsession since. So then I filled the walkways with wood chips, about 6 inches deep also, and I pulled the tarp back over the garden plot and just left it tarped for the rest of the winter, several more months, let it kind of warm up, and the tarp's more effective the warmer it gets. And then also, like, if the weeds start to grow as it warms up under the tarp, then there's no sunlight, so it just suffocates out any other weeds that would be trying to sprout up that time of year. So in the spring of that year, I pulled back the tarp and I moved it over to the next plot of the backyard to start killing the grass for the next garden expansion. Now, there were some weeds that the tarps didn't kill. It's mostly onion grass and Bermuda grass, I believe. So I went in with a fork and I dug them all out by hand, and I've done this for my entire garden at this point. Starting weed free is key. If you don't start weed free, you'll battle weeds forever. Then one of the most intimidating things for me was setting up the irrigation. I didn't know the first thing about it, but I started with a drip irrigation kit from Drip Depot. I'll leave a link below, and these kits just make it really easy. They come with everything you need to hook it up to your hose spigot on your house. I bought some grow lights and I put them on a wire rack in my basement to start seedlings, and then I bought an earthway seeder so that I could direct seed crops. So in April of that year, we transplanted and direct seeded our first no-till market garden crops, only to be hit with a late frost. So I had found this swing set in the trees behind the house. I bought some greenhouse plastic, put it over it, and I used this to harden off my seedlings. But I quickly realized I was going to need an actual greenhouse. I did extensive research on how to build a DIY greenhouse, and after getting several quotes from manufacturers, I bought my first Farmer's Friend caterpillar tunnel at the end of my first season. I built it over the winter, and then this provided me with some covered space to harden off my seedlings, and then several garden beds to extend my season. The following year, Daniel Mays released a book called The No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm. I bought the book as soon as possible, and I read it cover to cover several times. I spent every waking moment for the next several years, and still today, researching, studying, and watching YouTube videos. I implemented everything I learned in my own garden, and I learned how to improve by failing and observing. I never worked on a farm in my life, and I've only visited very few. I took Michael Kilpatrick's Farm Business Plan course, and as I built my business plan, I built it around what I had come to know as the most profitable market garden crops, mostly Salanova lettuce, arugula, spinach, and root vegetables such as radishes, carrots, turnips, and beets. My goal has always been to focus on crops that take 60 days or less, so I can turn over every single bed about 5 times per season. Some crops like arugula and radishes take closer to 30 days, so those beds can be turned over even more times per year. And that's how I make this profitable on a quarter acre. It's all about the fast turnover and high value crops. So I'm not growing things like sweet corn, broccoli, and cabbages. These types of crops do not produce high revenue per square foot of garden space. They can still be considered profitable crops, but just not in my context of quarter acre farming. And trust me, I've grown all these types of crops in the past. They never produce as much money as greens or roots, and every time I've tried to stray away from this business plan, I'm disappointed by the financial outcome. I now stick to the plan of only crops that take 60 days or less. The exception for me at this point are cherry tomatoes and heirloom tomatoes in the summer and hardneck garlic over the winter. But I also don't grow garlic in my backyard. I grow that at a property that I lease at this point. So we'll get into the leased property later, and I'll share with you how I've actually grown this business way beyond my backyard. But I basically lease a market garden in somebody else's property also at this point. I started selling my extra produce from under my desk at work. I formed an LLC, got a business license so I could start claiming all my gardening expenses as tax write-offs. I got an agricultural sales tax exemption so I don't pay sales tax on items purchased for agricultural activities. You only need to claim $1,000 in sales to qualify for an agricultural sales tax exemption in Tennessee. So I didn't have any actual sales on the books yet, so I made a spreadsheet of projected sales for the following year, and I wrote a letter to the IRS requesting an agricultural sales tax exemption. I didn't really know what to expect, but a few weeks later, I received a tax exemption in the mail, and ever since, I've cleared well over $1,000 in revenue to stay in good standing. And now, I've always documented my gardening journey on social media and making lots of posts for extra produce that I had for sale. Mostly people from work would place orders and I'd deliver them to my job, slinging veggies from coolers under my desk. And then a local chef started following me on Instagram, and I posted a picture of some carrots I had just harvested, probably like 100 pounds. And he sent me a message right away and he said, "Hey man, I'll take all those carrots off your hands." So I started bringing Chef Kendall all my extra produce on my way to work whenever I had it available. You know, sometimes it would be like several $100 per week, and I'd just take all that money and put it back into the business. In the fall of 2020, the second plot had been tarped for the entire summer. So I removed the tarp, moved it over to the next part of the yard, and then I started building the beds and walkways using compost and wood chips in the same manner that I built the first plot. Only this time, I immediately cover cropped the whole plot to winter rye. My soil type is hard compacted clay, so over the years I've relied on cover crops to help break up compaction and to add organic matter to the soil, using broad fork as needed. At first it was near impossible to broad fork, the clay was hard as concrete, but these days the soil in my backyard is like potting soil. If I knew back then what I know now, I would build a garden using a one-time tillage event and then convert it into a no-till system from there. But we'll save all the could have, should have for another video. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to share with you what I actually did. So next I started removing all the raised bed gardens. It's just not an efficient way to grow food in my context, so the raised bed gardens are all gone now and that whole area has been turned into market garden. So I continued building plots using the same methods: tarping, cover crop, crimp and tarp the cover crop, Then I use the cover crop as a sheet mulch and build beds on top of the mat of cover crop plant material. This method gives me a weed-free start that lasts most of the season. The deep roots of the cover crops add organic matter to the soil and open up waterways in the heavy clay for better drainage, while at the same time feeding the microbiology that has a symbiotic relationship with the deeply rooted cover crops that are capable of scavenging for nutrients from deep within the soil surface while adding biodiversity which boosts soil health for the subsequent crop, as well as many other benefits like breaking up pest and disease cycles. Every year since, I've added a Farmer's Friend Caterpillar tunnel. I currently have 4, and I have one of their new Caterpillar Tunnel Max partially assembled behind the gardens. We'll be installing that one soon, so stay tuned to check out their newest model, which is 21 feet wide and their heaviest duty model yet. I'm pretty excited to try this one out, which is 100% paid for by an NRCS grant. I'll be doing a video soon about how I funded all of this over the years, including how I've received tens of thousands of dollars in grant funding which does not need to be paid back. While I was working at the restaurant equipment store, I was able to acquire a 4-bay commercial sink and some commercial refrigeration, and I installed these in the basement of my house, and this gave me a climate-controlled space to wash, pack, and store everything. I've upgraded my wash pack station several times over the years, but I designed the entire thing with efficiency and portability in mind. Because I'm farming in my suburban backyard, it's always been the goal to move to a larger property. So when the time comes, everything will be easily moved and reinstalled at our next farm. That's why when it came to purchase more refrigeration, I built a mobile walk-in cooler. So when we move, I'm just going to hook this thing up and take it with me. The whole thing's on wheels. Now, I didn't buy everything all at once. I started with the 4-bay sink and 1 commercial reach-in refrigerator. I made it through my first season as a full-time market gardener with only the 2 reach-in refrigerators. But after that first season, I realized that the only way to grow my business's revenue would be to invest in more sufficient refrigeration. This is something you do not want to overlook. You cannot start a commercial vegetable operation without proper refrigeration. Next, I'm going to talk about how I managed to transition from working a 9-to-5 to full-time market gardening. As I mentioned before, I started selling a lot of extra produce to Chef Kendall at Simple on Severe. I didn't even know what to charge him, so I just started showing up at his restaurant and asking him what he was willing to pay. I was generally happy with what he would offer, so that really helped me to understand what types of prices I could charge other chefs, because it didn't take long before other local chefs started to notice my Instagram page. The owner of a local brick oven sourdough pizzeria called Adopo saw some Instagram posts that Chef Kendall had shared, and he reached out to me and asked if they could start buying salad greens. It was kind of like the middle of winter, so I told him to give me a few months and I'd reach back out in the spring. So I planted some arugula, salanova lettuce, and kale, just hoping he would actually buy it. And that spring, I messaged him back on Instagram. It had been a few months and I wasn't even sure if he remembered our conversation. But he didn't hesitate to buy it all right away, and I still work with him today. They buy about 20 pounds of lettuce and 30 pounds of arugula every single week. After that, word began to spread to many chefs around the town, and at this point, I've worked with most of the high-end restaurants in town. Some of the relationships come and go, and some stay and get stronger. It's absolutely true that 80% of my revenue comes from 20% of my clients, and as of today, I've moved my business to 95% restaurant sales. I'm no longer attending farmers markets, but we'll talk about all that in a different video. Because the real reason I was able to quit my job was because of the farmers markets. I could just show up with whatever I had and people would buy it. There was no real expectation. In the early days, I had Chef Kendall and Adopo, but I kept making my garden bigger and growing more and more crops. Eventually, I told my job that I wanted to only work 4 days a week so I could have an additional day to work in the garden every week. After about a year of working 4 days a week, I became more confident in my growing skills, and I applied to be a vendor at the farmers market at Market Square, where I once shopped weekly as a customer. Now, this is no small farmers market. There's 160 vendors with about 6,000 people worth of foot traffic every Saturday. It's one of the biggest farmers markets in the country, and being a vendor there ain't no joke. Because I'd shopped there for years, I'd done all the research. I knew there was a lot of foot traffic. I knew the people who shopped there were willing to spend a little extra. I knew I could charge higher prices than any other sales outlets. And most of all, I knew that there was a huge gap in the market for lettuce, spinach, and arugula. So I asked my bosses at K-Tom if they'd be willing to let me go down to 2 days a week. The plan was to work at K-Tom on Mondays and Tuesdays, and then work in my gardens on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and go to farmers markets on Saturdays. I attended my first farmers market in May of 2022. I thought that if I sold $200 to $300 worth of product, that would be considered a pretty successful first market. I sold out of everything I brought to my first farmers market, and I made about $650 if I remember correctly. The next week I called out of work and I told them I just had too much work to do on the farm because I also had restaurant orders coming in for the following week. I thought maybe I just got lucky. So the following week I went back to the farmers market with similar expectations, only this time to make $850. And I never went back to work after that again. That was about 3 years ago at this point. And ever since, I haven't gotten a paycheck. I don't get paid just for showing up to work and clocking in like a normal job. I only get paid if my crops are successful and if I can sell them. You gotta understand, this is a business, so just being good at growing vegetables, that's only part of it. You gotta be a hustler, baby. Ain't nobody buying nothing if I don't sell it, you understand? I got my sales outlets pretty well dialed in at this point, but no one's gonna buy anything from you if they don't know you have it, right? So when I have extra produce, I'm out here texting, calling, emailing everyone who's ever mentioned they might want to buy something. I don't stop until there's nothing left. I also use produce in exchange for goods and services. I'm typically trading for things like eggs, chickens, breads, chiropractic appointments, and I even pay my rent in vegetables at the property which I lease. And this type of stuff doesn't happen by accident. It happens because I'm out here hustling, baby, you know? It's all about building relationships with people. Tragedy strikes. Next, I'm going to talk about a series of events that happened in my first year in business that would have made most people quit. So before you go and quit your job, make sure you pay attention to this. Shortly after I quit my job, groundhogs moved in under my shed. I didn't know what was happening at first. I assumed it was deer. I was losing hundreds of dollars worth of carrots and salad greens every single day, and then I saw it. The biggest groundhog you could ever imagine. I started trapping them and I caught a couple, but that was exhausting. I tried all the things you can Google online, like plant garlic and marigolds and all kinds of weird things. I can assure you none of them worked. The groundhogs would give my marigolds a finger, walk right through my garlic, and eat all my carrots in a day. After nothing worked, as a last resort, I spent $1,600 on an electric deer fence from Premier One. This was the answer. Once I got the fence installed, the damage stopped. A couple of pro tips though. I put landscape fabric under the entire fence because if you allow the grass to touch it when it rains, it completely grounds out the fence and makes it non-effective. But also the rabbits and the groundhogs can lift up the bottom of the fence and sneak right under it. So I have the entire fence stapled to the ground. The bottom wire is not actually electrified, so I put 2 landscape staples down in between each post on the fence, so now that no critters can lift it up. It's stapled to the ground. This method keeps all the critters out of my garden, and I haven't had any severe damage since. But 2 days after I put up the electric fence, we got hit with a really bad storm that dropped 2 trees right on top of my brand new fence. I was devastated. It didn't take long before the groundhogs made their way back into the garden. But as I mentioned before, my good friend Paul from Mountain Roots Farm also has a tree service, and Paul was willing to come out and help me cut the trees off my fence and get them into a wood chipper in exchange for some labor on his farm. So I didn't actually have to spend any money on tree removal. Instead, I just went over there, I gave Paul a full day's worth of work on his farm, and he came here and helped me get the tree cleaned up. So huge shout out to Paul. And then, just as things started to get better in late September of that year, the main water line in front of my house burst at 2 in the morning, flooded out about 50% of my entire garden, not only taking all my revenue with it, but also all the soil which I'd worked so hard to build over several years. Basically washed away half my garden, shorted out my electric fence. It's crazy. Just as my season was ending, it was my last opportunity to make any money for the year. It was all just washed away in the blink of an eye, and there was nothing I could do about it. But this is my passion, baby, and failure's not an option. After each of those tragic events, I took that loss like a man. I went out, I started over. I rebuilt the farm, I fixed the fence, built more greenhouses, I kept it moving. Most people would have quit, no question about it. But I love this shit. I thrive in drudgery. I'm from the bottom, I'm a hustler, baby. And as a chef, I never really understood what they meant when they said if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. I thought I loved being a chef, but it always felt like work. But I don't feel like I have a job. I just do what I want to do every day. It just so happens that what I want to do every day is garden. So that's what I do. I try to make as much money as possible while I do it. Over the past couple of years, I've grown my gardening hobby into a 6-figure business, and I've grown it beyond my backyard. This year I signed a 5-year lease agreement to use about an acre of land on my friend's 80-acre homestead inside the Knoxville urban wilderness. I'm no longer attending farmers markets, and I've moved to a strictly restaurant sales business model, selling mostly everything I grow to about half a dozen local restaurants. But how much of that is profit? And is this actually a viable way that you could make a living? I mean, there's so many variables to that question. Firstly, I don't do it for the money. I do it for the lifestyle. I followed my passion, and the money came later. You do not want to start a market garden if money is your sole purpose. There are way better ways to make money. This is something you choose to do for the lifestyle. You know what I mean? I don't go to work every day. I just walk outside to my backyard. I don't have a boss to tell me what to do or where to be, what time to be there. In fact, I don't ever do anything I don't want to do. If something needs to get done and I don't want to do it, I just pay my workers. It goes through payroll and it's all tax deductible. For instance, mowing the lawn or cleaning the gutters on the house. It all gets done by my workers. It all goes through the payroll, whereas a regular person works a job, gets taxes taken out of your paycheck, and then you hire a company to do those types of services. Whatever I need done, I just pay my workers to do it, and they're typically happy to do so because none of us want to go get a regular job. So when I quit my job, I had enough money saved to pay my bills for 2 years with no potential income. You must be prepared to make no money for some amount of time whenever you start any business. But through hard work and dedication, a viable income can be achieved on a small piece of land, and I'm living proof of that. But I also have an amazing wife who supported me through this journey. While we started out doing this together, it didn't take long for her to realize that this was not for her. But she has a great job with benefits that allows us to live this lifestyle, and I don't need to make $100,000 a year salary. We have no kids, so outside of me making sure the dogs are fed, I have zero responsibilities in life outside of my garden. And I'm 100% able and willing to work up to 100 hours a week in the rain, sleet, snow, hail, or over 100-degree southern summer heat. I thrive in drudgery and stressful situations. I love pushing my body to my physical limits. Your situation could be very different from mine in that regard. Our mortgage payment is only $800 a month, and my wife pays half. I pay for my leased property and vegetables, leaving very low overhead for me on that property. So your cost of acquiring land could be very different from mine. And generally speaking, I use the business to fund my lifestyle, and I don't need anything out of life besides happiness. All the money in the world couldn't get me to go back to a real job. But this is just my journey, and I hope it helps you to create your own.